So you've decided you want to work with trace data. What does that mean? Let's talk a little bit about what it takes to work with it and what the process might look like. It doesn't look the same for everyone, but we can get a general sketch of the kinds of things you need to think about and some of the capabilities or capacities you have to have, and some sort of warning boxes to check along the way. I think some people think about this as a difference between data that's been designed or created versus data that's been found. And elsewhere, I'm sure you've heard this, but I'm very critical of this idea of found data in any sense. Oh, you've dropped this data, let me use it. It's not an end. You've dropped this data and it is a pure representation of the world because it is untainted by scientists, and therefore let me use that. There is no such thing as found data. All data is made. Data is the outcome of datafication. Everything exists in a process of datafication. The difference is that you may have designed that process if you are a social scientist that's engaged in more traditional work, whereas in this case, someone else has designed that process, or some group or entity or assemblage of groups and entities have designed this process. So the data doesn't just appear. It's not there to mine. It's not, I think a little bit about Neo, where he kind of sees the data underneath the world around him. It's not like that. The data doesn't generate this stuff. The real world generates the data. And so you have to understand that process of datafication if you want to make use of trace data. So what is this stuff? We can think about trace data as being the byproduct of large socio-technical systems. And we've always had it, but especially during the period of digitization, that went along with datafication. So we have a much greater potential, at least, to access these large collections of transactional, usually some kind of transactional data that we can then use to help to inform our models and our theories. Some things to kind of keep in mind from the very beginning. It's a byproduct of the systems. The work of making use of data work is an interpretive process. From the very moment you try to bring it in to the point at which you're cleaning and making use of it, and it's in the analysis process and the presentation, that whole process is a process of interpretation. It may not feel that way because it's at scale. It may not feel that way because you're using tools that other people have designed, but it is still interpretation. It's just at a different scale. And also that, although I'm going to talk about them a little bit in stages, this idea of acquiring trace data, cleaning it, assembling it, analyzing it, and presenting it feels like they're stages, but they're not separable stages. A mistake made at one will kind of snowball into the other pieces. And so if you make a choice somewhere early on in the collection process, that's going to propagate forward. That's going to have effects on each stage that follows. So where do you get this stuff? Where do you find where do you mine? Where do you dust for trace data? Traditionally, I would say kind of very traditionally, you have a kind of administrative records and institutional records of some sort. I may have mentioned my mom went and did her PhD about when I did, and did fieldwork in history, and went to a small town called Teruel in Spain, and looked at, because Teruel was one of the few places where they had actually barred the Inquisition. They barred the gates and said, you may not enter. And so Teruel had mostly demographic records that went back before the Inquisition, and demonstrated sort of that there was a lot more conviviality among people of different backgrounds before the Inquisition, that people kind of got along pretty well and intermarried and had families together and that sort of thing. But this was something the Inquisition was trying to wipe out. We think about the Inquisition as wiping out people in the main, but that's not really what they were after. They were after data. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition when we're talking about data science, but that's the fact of it. Anyway, that was... So she had to get that data, she had to acquire that data, she had to, I think I mentioned in another lecture, that she had to go to this small nunnery in Spain and sort of make friends with the archivists, and they would give her access to those records, right? So that, I think the traditional piece of this is kind of administrative. You get access to the administrative records of an organization or an institution. This is how you might get information, for example, from a public utility, or from a city, or from something like that, or a business, something like that, right? Or you might be able to pull it from archival or third-party data sets. This is the graduate student's dream, which is kind of pre-cooked or frozen meal forms of data, where you kind of just pull it off of Kaggle and suddenly you've discovered something new out of a data set that was publicly available. So some of that is kind of historical data dumps, leaked data, corpora from somewhere else. We'll talk about this, but all of these come with their own problems. I think that for a long time, what we were really focused on was APIs, especially platform APIs. There has been what one person has called, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to say this. I have a hard enough time saying the word apocalypse anyway, but it is the I guess it's still apocalypse. It's just spelled with API at the beginning. API apocalypse. I can't say that, but this idea that the APIs that for a while we were able to get large scale data from have largely shut down over the last several years, or at least have been made much more difficult to access it at scale. And some of this was already a problem well before this. Who got access to large scale Twitter data? Well, people who could afford access to something that they was kind of colloquially called the fire hose. And that was really, really expensive data to get. And it had serious problems as well. But especially as these, there are different tiers. Twitter at this point is a mess, but no matter what you're using, there are often different tiers of access, and they become more and more expensive. This didn't used to be the case in part because I think many platforms didn't realize the value of the data that they had. And now that they have, and that they're not necessarily making money from advertising the way they used to, at least, they're trying to extract as much money from this data as possible. And that means that they've priced it in ways that make it often out of reach for the average researcher. What that means is at different tiers, you might have rate limits. At the free tier, you might get very little out of an API. If you pay a little bit more, you might get a little bit more. The data that they disclose might be very selective in terms of class of data. You might not be able to get certain information that is in in fact, you almost certainly will not get certain information that is within the system itself. And they may, that's a systematic sort of thing where that you can't get people's passwords, right? To take the most extreme example. But there's other pieces of that you probably won't be able to get that information. But the problem is that in some cases you can't get it from only a group, only part of it because of algorithmic choices around selection bias. And there's a whole issue around if you've been in 510 with me, where I ask people to use the Reddit API to pull data from Reddit, it's super annoying because halfway through the course, each semester I have to rewrite that because Reddit has changed their API, and sometimes they change it halfway through the course. That's a problem for a course, but it's also a problem for anyone who's trying to collect data on a consistent basis, because you're always trying to play catch up with the policies, the pricing, and the actual API itself and what you can get access to. This has become a huge issue for people who just really thought we were going to have this universe of data coming from platforms, and largely that has kind of shrunk or disappeared. The other option here is web scraping. And we do, if you're in 510 now, or you've had it in the past, you've done web scraping. There are issues around this because of the ways in which you can collect public-facing data. There's some significant legal ambiguity on this. One of my colleagues has just gone through a huge court case in which they took it all the way up to the Supreme Court as to whether maybe researchers have something that looks a little bit like fair use that would get us around questions of access to these data via scraping. And so a whole set of questions around the legality and the ethics and the ways in which you can use that scraped data. Now, I'm a proponent for scraping data. I have a paper about how to avoid the terms of service. I've staked out a position in a lot of conferences and that sort of thing as someone who thinks that we should be more pragmatic about how we approach the terms of service, but that it comes with a lot of headaches. Often people who are not working in the academic structure and who care very little about ethics are using web scraping pretty extensively and doing this whole spy versus spy thing where they buy large botnets to do the scraping so that they can avoid being detected by the platform, for example, and that becomes expensive in and of itself, and that really does open up a can of worms in terms of the ethical questions. In an earlier module, I think I've linked to a paper where I've written a bit on data donation, and I think right now it's not an easy thing to do, and there's some arguments among scholars about how you do it more effectively and whether you allow the individual to edit out data they don't want to donate when they donate a chunk of data to you, and a whole bunch of questions around that. But it does provide, especially now that there's some policies around whether platforms must make available to the users whatever data they've collected. If users can then download that and then are willing to donate it to you, that allows for some really interesting ways of making sure that you're respecting the users themselves and not sort of piling on to some of the ethical concerns of platforms that are exploiting them. But it also opens up some possibilities for more participation among those users in your research, and a bunch of other little pieces that are kind of interesting. Automating that process has proven to be a little difficult. I had been working actually on a plugin for browsers that would allow for people to more easily donate their browsing data, for example. But there were a couple of cases of people with such plugins that had then used them for nefarious purposes. And so that ruined it for those of us who were trying to be transparent about how we might use it. but that remains a possibility. Can we create an infrastructure for donation that makes that a little easier? So those are kind of the broad ways in which we would kind of have access to trace data. It's not really trace data if you're working for the organization that's collecting it. So I've worked with, for example, graduate students who work for city government or who work for a large, utility or public transportation organization or for a large company. And if you work for, say, an airline and you have all this data around passenger information, that's not really trace data. It's pretty central to your organization's kind of lifeblood. But there are some overlaps there between it, depending on how you can and should use that data. When you're engaged in this process, I should note that I've already kind of thought about this and out loud as I'm rambling through some of these sources, is you have to keep asking consistently some of these questions around the decisions that were made that are basically theoretical decisions on your side, because those who collected the data initially probably didn't engage in those. And what are the behaviors that are rendered visible, which is naturally kind of pretty central to the question, but also what's excluded, who isn't in who and what are not in these data. That's a pretty central question when you're doing any kind of instrument to collect stuff. But when that instrument is not designed by you, you have to think much more seriously about who it might be making invisible to your process. And on the other side of it, who might be getting sort of an unreasonable amount of visibility. Most of these systems have some kind of algorithmic bias. That's why we use them. I was talking to a student just recently about this, that bias is not, we think about like biased media, the biased New York Times or the biases of Google. That's their business. We don't want a Google that shows us everything. That's kind of how they became the predominant search engine, because they were better at filtering out and making less visible things that we were less likely to want to see, I should say. We don't want a New York Times that prints all the news. We only want them printing all the news that's fit to print. That is, we want them to provide us with maybe balance, but we really rely on journalists and editors to say, these are the most important stories of the day. That's why we have newspapers and not just feeds, at least for now. Some of that is going away. People may not see that as valuable as it was in the past. All to say that all of these platforms and all of these systems bias the data in one way or another, and you have to be very, very thoughtful about what that means. What kinds of resolution in terms of time or in terms of individuals do you have, and who's excluded and who's included, and what behaviors or aspects of those behaviors are included or excluded, all have to be kind of at the top of mind when you're making use of trace data. It should be when you're producing your own data as well. It's just a lot more easily seen, maybe, when you're designing the instrument through which you're collecting that data. And even before you start, so I should back up for just a second and talk about what may be called a data diary, or just a research notebook. At each of these steps, you need to be very explicitly taking this out of your brain and recording how it is that you've acquired the data, so you don't have to rely on your memory about how you may have altered it or the kinds of choices you've made. So you should very explicitly be writing down, this is why I approached this data. This is what I was hoping from it. This is what I actually got. This is what I'm worried about along the way. So that process should be documented, both for your own use and potentially for others to see later on. So I'll put that out there. None of this should be sort of you just kind of doing it by the seat of your pants. I mean, it is kind of. You're bound to be improvising to a certain extent. But as you're improvising, you need to be recording. And so I would keep a separate kind of stream of notes around your kind of data, how you acquired and altered the data that you're using. Some of this might be broadly thought about as the provenance of the data. This gets really messy when you're pulling data from multiple kinds of platforms or multiple organizations, or, and this is very frequently the case now, when they've already done that for you and you're getting second and third and fourth degree forms of data, where someone has already done some kind of cleaning and analysis or combination of that data and then passed it on to someone else who used it in a different set and then pass it on, and you finally get it at the end of all of this. So you do need to think about kind of the process by which the data move from an observation into datafication. You have to think about the datafication process throughout. Again, there is no data without datafication. The data is just kind of this imprint that comes out of the datafication process. So understanding that process is vital. So you need to, when you look, if you're, for example, collecting from APIs, you need to read the API documentation carefully and critically, and think not just about it as a practical guide, but what is it telling you about the kinds of data that are being collected and the kinds of ways in which those may be revealed to you. You need to think about we always have to deal with missing data. That's true of doing surveys or anything else. But what do missing fields or errors tell you about what might be going on in the black box of that collection, or what might those mistakes or missing pieces or truncations, what might they say about the way in which the data is stored or archived or provided to you, the kinds of biases that might be built into that process. How confident are you that the kinds of data and timestamped data is accurate? do we have the resolution to know that these are being collected correctly? Is there, when you look at data, you will frequently find this case in which missing data on dates gets reported as the Unix birthday, which is, in the early 1970s. This was an issue more recently in Social Security data, where, we had the unfortunate sort of very young people who thought they were doing data science on the Social Security records and found all of these 200-year-old people who were getting Social Security benefits. And they had simply missed that, those people were not getting benefits. They were still in the records, but no longer getting benefits. Or in some cases that the date had been it was a missing date and had gone back to 1900. And so you had a whole bunch of people that were born in 1900. And that was probably an indicator of an error in the data rather than large-scale malfeasance. So you have to think about whether, what happens with some of these data and whether it gets filled in weird ways. And again, you should be recording, how well do you know where this data came from, how it was acquired, the process by which it was acquired? Is it original to the place you're getting it from? How much of that information can you get in order to talk about the provenance of the data that you're using? And it's very rare that you get a data set that is usable as is. So, and if you have, you probably missed something. So you have to think about cleaning that data. And I think cleaning sounds like you're hiding something. And that's not really what it's supposed to be. What you're supposed to be doing is trying to unhide things, right? Just because you've removed records that are problematic does not mean that you've somehow revealed the truth. So you have to decide what is it in the data that counts, that fits into your model, that fits into your theoretical approach. And then, how do you handle missing data or data that seems to be corrupted in some way or that may not fit into the categories or structures you've established? So all of the processes of cleaning or encoding or altering, all of them come with certain assumptions. You're going to have some kind of loss in your transformations. When you take data and you move it to something else, there's bound to be, anytime you're kind of massaging data, and again, this sounds like you're trying to fake something, but anytime you're making the data more usable for your analysis, you're incurring the possibility and actually the likelihood that you've changed something along the way. And so are those transformations something that are relatively benign, or could they infect your conclusions in ways that are damaging? That process, that reduction, or that reclassification or re-encoding or post-coding, like go into a whole bunch of different words that are part of the cleaning process. It's not inherently bad. In fact, it's, as I said, entirely necessary. Often the degree to which it is bad or necessary and yet acceptable is often the degree to which you've been transparent about that process. Axel Bruns, who's a researcher in Australia, and I, because I'm Alex Halliday and he's Axel Bruns, some people early on would somehow confuse us because I don't understand that at all, because we do not look alike in any way at all. But Alex, Axel, easy enough, right? Axel Bruns has been very good about, he was an early blogger, as was I, which is again probably one of the reasons people may have gotten us confused. But he's been very good about, even though journals may not publish the very detailed process of this, he's tried to do that on his own. So a lot of the work that he does talks about his process in a lot of detail on his blog. And so we've talked a lot about that, about the importance of that transparency and how we can make sure that the work we're doing is far more transparent, that some of these data diaries that we're developing are actually surfaced in some way and made available to others. There's a huge push towards archiving research data for a bunch of reasons: to avoid fraud, to allow for replication, to allow people to kind of check your work and see if you've maybe made an error along the way, not as a gotcha, except when you're engaged in fraud, but simply to say, okay, well, something in your analysis was a little off, but I can use your data and figure out if I can go through your steps and figure out what you've done. So providing the data that you're using at the raw level, at least raw level to the degree that you can without worrying about issues of identification, that sort of thing, can be very useful. But the process, I think, is even more useful. Like, I don't really need to have your data if I can see I kind of do, but if I can see the precise process by which it was arrived at. And so being very transparent about that cleaning process is really important. Again, this is why your data diary is really important. So I'm talking in the abstract here. We have a data wrangling class that doesn't deal as much with data wrangling as the kind of large part of the job that it is. I saw one survey among data scientists who said that the sort of data wrangling and cleaning part of this was 90% of their job. The actual analysis presentation was a much smaller segment of it. Most of it was dealing with messy data and making it usable. That means deduplication, identity resolution. That is, if you have, if you wanted to look at my citation record, you'd find my name spelled. I think I've gotten down to about 7 or 8 different ways for my surname. So do you have canonical names, canonical IDs? Is there a way that you can make sure that your data is collapsing those so that you're not recording one person as 8? What do you do with the classic example, which is what do you do with null values or missing values or truncated values, things that are, or corrupted in some way data? How do you handle that? How do you normalize formats across different sources? So, if you've got a data collection that actually pulls from multiple sources, how do you make sure that these are comparable in such a way that you can do things like deduplicate them? That is, take away multiple records that may be referring to the same observation? Do you want to filter out bots? Do you want to filter out nonsense? Do you say that, it's pretty common to say that no matter what the data is, that data that is very short or very long shouldn't be included. You can do that. That there are some good conceptual reasons to do that as long as you're very explicit and, again, transparent about that process. It can be helpful. This is especially true for machine learning, where you don't want, for example, documents with 3 words in them. It doesn't make sense to include that in a lot of machine learning or categorization processes. So it's pretty common in that case to kind of cut off the extremes. But what do you lose in that? So you have to think seriously about whether you're losing something important when you do that. Yeah, and do you kind of so let's to go back to the talk about web. About web logs, about access logs, in that, more than 50% of the traffic on the World Wide Web is actually bots. It's bots going out and crawling materials, mostly from search engines. Google itself is probably a quarter of all the traffic on the World Wide Web because it goes out and crawls these consistently. And so if you're analyzing those logs, one of the first things you probably do is say, okay, can I just exclude all the bots? Because they're not really what I'm concerned with. And so you can think about whether things about bots or spam or other kinds of automatic processes, if you're trying to study people, maybe the automatic processes don't matter as much. So it's a really interesting question because, especially if you're taking this idea that it's not just the people that are agents, it's useful to kind of think of a larger sea of things. But there are reasons you might want to remove things that are deliberately spam, for example. And then there are a set of kind of questions around text processing about whether you're going to do things like tokenize large groups of text or standardize spelling or deal with language differences or even things like as simple as character sets, right? How are you going to represent this data so that it's standard across all of your records? And so that form of standardizing and representing and then recoding in some ways, right? So you might decide that I've been pushing on you using surveys with open items, and I do think that's useful, not in all cases, but in some cases. In that case, you have to postcode them. How are you postcoding them in a way that's reasonable, right? That can add a lot of texture because you can get some power out of figuring out what the categories are post hoc instead of pre hoc. But it does require a step that opens up the possibility for bias being introduced. So basically, you need to do everything you can to avoid either introducing new bias through that process of cleaning or amplifying existing biases. Is your process going to remove completely users from a collection that might have already been marginalized, for example? Will it privilege more legible forms of participation over lurking, for example? Are you going to be privileging certain kinds of behaviors over others? Does it focus on central tendencies over the very interesting kind of corner examples? My dissertation looked at Slashdot, and in Slashdot, once your karma on a particular post, once you got downvoted enough, it didn't delete the post. But if it was on Reddit, if you have a negative certain number of downvotes, it's still pretty visible. But on Slashdot, it hid that, and so it would be kind of normal to say, okay, well, that's not really part of my analysis because it's been hidden to most users. But there was actually a pretty interesting subculture that had been built on people who were engaging in ways on Reddit that were deliberately trying to push themselves into these sort of spaces beneath, I guess. And so, is the process by which you're cleaning this data actually excluding groups that would produce a very interesting mix, a very interesting analysis of what's actually going on? As we noted, a lot of this data is sort of how many heartbeats over a particular minute, or how many times has someone gone through this door, which in and of itself is not very interesting. The interest comes when you can combine that with other sources and really reach some interesting insights because of that combination of data. Really unexpected insights that you would not, that nobody that was actually producing this data would expect that you could extract from their traces. The problem is that these collections from various different spaces, especially if you're not just doing 2 or 3, but dozens or more, that how you align these can be very tricky. They often will use incompatible identifiers. This is why we have things like the advertising ID and standardized IPs, and a lot of these things are made for interoperability of the systems themselves. And to the degree that you can leverage those to allow for interoperability of your trace data, that's great. But in many cases, they are not compatible. And so what you have to do is sort of you could think of it as, for some, the gears might mesh perfectly, but for others, you really have to figure out how to mush those gears together. And so you might have things that are kind of, you might have a delay for asynchronous, timestamps might not align perfectly because the timing of the systems is not aligned perfectly. You might have different kinds of units of analysis between users or sessions or devices or whatever. The actual units being used to separate out this data might be different. You might have differing ideas of what the same sort of unifying event would be, right? As I said, you may think that people are at Dunkin' Donuts when they're really just upstairs sitting on their couch checking in. And so can you align these different data in such a way that you can actually assemble them? Especially for social network data, a lot of government surveillance and other surveillance has relied on the idea that if you're in the same place consistently with someone else, that you're probably linked in some way. But think about the models you have to use to think about that, right? What model do you use to decide whether people are actually encountering one another versus simply, passing, like ships passing in the night? Is it outside of their usual space? You can think about the kind of algorithmic process by which you would align these, but it's never going to be perfect. You're going to have some sort of, in statistics, we talk about these errors that are over-inclusive, basically. And so you're going to have some inclusivity errors here where you assume that two people are associated and then they are not. And that becomes a problem. I forget what the two names are for the Terry Gilliam film, Brazil. But, if somebody accidentally, if an insect accidentally gets if an actual bug gets into your process and you conflate two people, it can have some pretty extreme outcomes. And so how do you determine whether two people are the same person? How do you determine whether two events are the same event in terms of time? How do you link them in terms of space? Especially that latter one, I've worked with quite a bit. And, I worked with a student who did some work on where we tried to geolocate some of the connections between some online events. And you can use things like IP addresses, but or backlocating the IP address. But things like, even though we use them because they are a convenient kind of collector, things like zip codes are not ideal, right? I mean, they do tend to be used because they are convenient, but they were really designed for use by the postal system and not really for anything else. And so if you're using that as your geolocation piece, if you're saying that two people in the same zip code share anything, if you're using that as a grouper of some kind, and especially with nine-digit zip codes, it can be pretty useful to try to do that. But it can, that's a decision that's been made. These are not square spaces. These are not, they're not really determined by anything other than where the postal carrier needs to go. And so you have to think a little bit about kind of how do you decide whether two people are in the same space or not, or in the same time or not, or the same person or same group or not. That process is really where a lot of these interpretive moves happen. And again, I would just keep saying it. As long as you're being very explicit about how you're making those interpretive moves, that's not a problem. It's kind of the process. That's how we make useful inferences from data. But you have to talk about what kinds of interpretations and assumptions you're making when you do that. So what are the strategies you use for that? You can do something that is deterministic, where you have actual unique IDs between people, social security numbers, or Apple IDs, or IMEIs. That's a little bit more inferential. You can do some kind of probabilistic matching, where you say, oh, these seem like the names are pretty similar. Maybe it was an error in the way they were recorded. My cell phone is not actually in my last name because someone along the way mistyped my last name and swapped two letters. And it is I've actually talked to people at the cell phone company at Verizon about this, and they're just like, no, don't change it. You're going to mess everything up. So, maybe we can do something where we say even though these names don't match, maybe they're still the same person, especially with someone with a weird name like mine. That's something like this, but similarity rather than identity. And then context, like shared infrastructures, shared spaces. Maybe these are shared behaviors. Maybe these people are similar because of the things they do and where they're doing them. It's worth noting in this, of course, that you're building a model. You've taken the data that is trace data and then you're assembling it in such a way that it makes these kinds of assumptions and simplifies and flattens it a bit. And that's a natural part of this, but it is important all along this process not to get enchanted with the idea that we have a perfect model of the world, because we don't. And so when you're making intentional moves like this, what you have to realize that it is moving towards a model that has a theoretical basis, and you have to keep that kind of at the forefront as you're doing it. Do you trust the data that you have? And a lot of this is sort of, does it work at the gut level? Which is terrible to say, right? Because that's not scientific at all. But if you look at it, does it seem like the data looks like it is something like what you would expect? And either way, if the answer is yes, then maybe you're moving down the road towards a basic kind of face level validity. And if it's no, there could be two reasons for that. Either the data's wrong or you've just discovered something really interesting. So either way, getting a feeling for that face validity is really important. It's a little tricky with large data because you have to think about like spot checking or sampling in some way that you can try to figure out whether this makes sense. You can do some things like, you can make, the things that they tell you in a basic stats class, which is never don't make it a scatter plot. It's this kind of idea of saying, okay, I need to get some handle on this data. And so some of that is just kind of messing with it a little and looking at things like central tendencies and descriptive stats, but also maybe visualizing some of it before you've done much analysis to make sure that it makes sense. Is there a weird discontinuity? So I've had Twitter data where I was working with a colleague in Washington. This is before Twitter was had an API that was working. So this is not after they stopped making their API work, but before they really had a working API. And so we were scraping data from Twitter, and we were running this on 6 different systems. And we had a period where, and you couldn't see this by looking at the data. It wasn't until you charted it over time that, we looked at total number of tweets per minute, for example. And every hour at a certain time, it would drop out. And we're like, oh crap, even though we were running this on multiple systems, was there something that went wrong here? Like, was there something in our software that wasn't right? Was there something in our combination that didn't go right? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm pretty sure it caused us to look very carefully. It seemed like it was an artifact on Twitter's side, that every hour they were doing something where it just hiccuped during this particular period in which we were collecting data. So, because we went back and checked, and nobody was tweeting for this, this period of about 30 seconds at the top of each hour. So there was some kind of a reset process or something that was happening on Twitter's side, but we needed to see that to make sure there wasn't some error in our instrument in the way that we had collected these data. So kind of, can you triangulate across your data sets, or can you look at face validity, or can you cut it in various ways where you can see, at a sanity check level, does this make sense? Is there something obviously wrong with this data? Finally, and it feels like I'm saying this over and over again, but we have to think about we've talked about provenance in terms of the accuracy or the validity of the data we're collecting, but there's also the question of whether the data is being collected and acquired in ways that are useful and that are ethical. If you get a large set of data from Facebook, it has not ever been, there's been no process of consent, I would argue, even though their terms of service say you are consenting to a bunch of stuff. I suspect if you ask the average Twitter user what was in the terms of service, they would know almost nothing about it. I don't, and I've used Meta services and Twitter services, and certainly not informed consent. Right? They don't understand that I don't think most users really think about the fact that they are the product and not the customer. I don't think most of them think about the secondary use of their data and how that has led to profits by the platforms. So there is no informed consent in this case. So this is something that has to go into your questioning of the data that's been traced when you get it from places like this. That the ethical choices of those organizations become your choices. They become part of your process. Now, it may not be that you're using medical data collected by the Nazis, which is kind of the classic example of whether you can use tainted data, right? It may not be that obvious or extreme, but it is still a challenge. You need to think about whether you can ethically make use of these data. It's not a no. I've used data from all of these platforms. I think that there is a case to be made for it, but you have to be ready to make that case, and you have to have thought about what that case might be. You have to think about whether the processes you're engaged in then alter this. The cleaning, the assembly, the storage and sharing afterwards, which we haven't talked as much about, but are you archiving this and then sharing it on? Are you de-identifying that material when you do? And what does that mean when you de-identify it? Are you doing it properly? Are you doing it effectively? Or does it hide something in a systematic way that is actually harming the community, at least? You have to think about those harms also. In the human subjects perspective, we think about the harms to the subjects more than we do to the communities in many cases. But especially when you're using this kind of trace data, you have to think about the potential harms because there's no one else there to think about them for you. So, the users may not realize this trace data even exists. And so before you make use of it, you have to be thinking about what kinds of harms this might introduce to not just the individuals, but to the community as a whole. And so at each one of those processes, you need to think about the ways in which your ethical choices are affecting power relationships and not just your intent in using it, but the effect of that use, right? So you may have every intent of engaging in work that is liberatory or emancipatory, that helps everybody on the planet, and particularly the people that you're studying. But you really need to think about the potential of harm as well, and the effects that may have, both in the terms of the process of acquiring the data, by the original recording of the data, by your reacquisition of the data, by the cleaning, by the assembly, and then by the analysis and re-release, either in summarized form or in some cases in archival form. And each of those is a potential pitfall. And so going through that process in a way that is well recorded and well thought out and reflexive is an essential part of making use of these data. Remember that this is, even though it is big data, still an interpretive process at each one of those steps. And if anything, it is, I think, less that interpretive process can be hidden in those layers in ways that are dangerous. So it is vital that we are more transparent about where our assumptions and interpretations have been cast as we work with trace data. Thank you.